Hello, good evening, buenas tardes to all the people who have logged on today to our webinar. Before I introduce the two speakers for today, I would like to just talk a little bit about the reason we're holding this webinar and also some of the ground rules for the next hour. So in terms of rules, the idea here is to have an interactive chat with Senior Lecturer Jason J. and Adriana. And the idea would be Jason will speak for about a half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we will take questions and Adriana will moderate the questions. For people to ask questions, please use the Q&A on the bottom of the screen. You're more than welcome to ask questions in English or in Spanish. Adriana will be happy to translate and to give those questions to Jason. Unfortunately, all of the answers will be in English. But when you do the Q&A, you're also able to upvote. That means if someone else has already asked a question that you like, please say like and the votes go up. If you can, please try to avoid using the chat for questions because it'll be difficult for us to track both of them. That being said, I'd like to welcome everybody again and present Jason J. Jason is a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan. He's also the director of the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. He's the author of the book Breaking Through Gridlock, The Power of Conversation in a Polarized World. Jason did his undergraduate at that other school in Cambridge that we don't speak at, but he got it right for his PhD and he did it at MIT. Jason is a very good friend of the MIT Sloan Latin America office, which I'm the director. And this webinar is really here to be a placeholder for our sustainability conference that we were hoping to have this July in Lima. Our partner was BRECA, and the manager of sustainability, Adriana Quiros, was excellent, arranging everything and all was set, but then that nasty pandemic came through. So this hour today will just be a placeholder, but once the world gets back into a better shape, we look forward to holding this conference and also working with both Jason, the Sustainability Initiative, and BRECA. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Adriana. Thank you again all for being here today.
Thank you, Lee. We are looking forward to having you in Lima soon and all of MIT as well. I would just like to extend your welcome today to everyone that's joining us from Peru, and especially those of you from BRECA. Just a little background on BRECA before we start. BRECA is a highly diversified economic conglomerate that has been based in Peru for 130 years. And if you know anything about Peru, you know we've had our ups and downs regarding history. So BRECA has managed to survive everything from wars to devastating earthquakes, land reforms, other social and economic crises, and now, well, just like everyone else, we're facing COVID-19. But we're sure we're not only going to survive this crisis, we're sure that we're going to thrive for at least another 100 years more. And this is because we have an approach to innovation and sustainability that are the key to our resilience. Not only do we have this sustainability strategy that goes throughout all of our companies in the group, but we also have sustainability embedded in our values and our everyday work. And that is why I'm so happy to be here with MIT and all of you today to start this conversation, because we want to push sustainability forward. So without further ado, I would like to pass the mic over to Jason. And please be sure to pay attention, because what he's going to say is not only important for all of us sustainability practitioners, but for everyone that's in a business with a purpose. So go ahead, Jason.
Thank you so much, Adriana, and thank you so much, Lee, for having me here and for bringing together what looks like a fantastic audience here on this webinar. So what I'm going to talk about today is about innovating for sustainability, and particularly in this challenging moment where we find ourselves right now. First, I want to just talk about time and our time horizons. I think as business leaders, we're used to thinking about time in kind of a quarterly horizon, a quarterly rhythm. Our earnings reports, our analyst reports, thinking about these movements in the stock market, dramatic that we've seen over the last 2 quarters as we have wrestled with the pandemic globally. And this is sort of the normal window of time that we find ourselves thinking in. What my personal experience of right now with the COVID pandemic is that my time horizon, our time horizon collectively has massively contracted and shrunk. We're thinking about things on a day-to-day kind of basis. For me, I am very lucky to be in a sort of a relatively stable work environment, but my home life has been thrown into a bit of chaos. Every day we get new assignments for our kids from the teachers, and we're grappling with a different daily schedule. But there are many people who are grappling with their survival of their businesses on a day-to-day basis, of whether they have the cash flow to be able to stay afloat. And there are really billions of people in the world who are at risk of not knowing where their next meal comes, as, for example, schools are closed that were the primary source of meals for low-income children and families in India. So in a moment like this, where we're kind of reacting on a day-to-day basis to the emerging news and the emerging challenges that we all face, I have to first sort of invite us to just take a deep breath and a step back to consider a wider picture and a longer time horizon. And not only am I going to ask us to stretch back to that quarterly perspective, or even that yearly perspective, or that 5-year strategy time horizon, but I'm going to ask you to go way past that. We're just going to go blow way past that and think about time in a fundamentally different way, in a deep way. And I'm going to call this deep time. And a deep time perspective is to think about time on the scale of billions of years. 4.5 billion years ago, this planet formed. And this is a picture of the eons, meaning time thought of in 500 million year chunks since the beginning of our planet. And then from there, let's contract a little bit and think about time in the hundreds of millions of years horizon, which is really the birth of life on the planet Earth, when organisms first formed and started to change the landscape of our the biogeochemical system of the Earth. And then we can double click a little further on this last era of the Cenozoic era and think about the periods on the scale of tens of millions of years in which larger land animals, including mammals, have become dominant species on the planet. And it's only in this last tiny period of time, the quaternary period, over the last 1 million years, that we've seen anything like humans being on this planet. And only the last tiny little slice of time of 10,000 years of human civilization, and only the tiniest slice of this last 200 years of industrial development. And I think it's really important to step way back from all of that, because this whole period, this whole history that we all share, has created these incredible investments in a bank account that we're all able to live on, a wealth that we're all able to live on, from the fossil fuels in the ground that we get to use for our energy, to the composition of the atmosphere that we can breathe, to a stable climate that supports and enables the infrastructure that we've been able to build. And we've been able to tap into that wealth to do some really incredible things as a species over the last, particularly 100, 120 years. We've grown our global population really dramatically. This is a set of graphs that comes from the Netherlands government agency, and the numbers go back to 2015. Already in the last 5 years, this population has grown to 7.7 billion people. Real GDP has gone up 3.5% per year globally, steadily over the last 50 years. And with that has come these incredible growth in our energy use, our food production, international tourism, transportation, the land under cultivation. We've had incredible success as a species on this planet relative to all these other organisms that we share the planet with. And we've also made some incredible achievements as far as our social progress, as far as for providing for the basic human needs and the human thriving of those 7.7 billion people. So these indicators like malnutrition and child mortality and the number of people living without access to sanitation or electricity, the number of people in extreme poverty have all been on this incredible and steady decline. And this is the transformation that's really the victory of the modern industrial society, is that we've been able to achieve these gains. And this is part of what we get to celebrate as we've tapped into these resources. Now, there's still some way to go. These numbers need to get themselves to zero, ideally. And so we can think about a shortfall, a gap here depicted as these sort of red spaces here, where ideally everyone in the world would have basic food security, reliable nutrition to meet their caloric needs. And there's about 1 billion people, somewhere between 700 million and 1 billion people who don't have reliable access to food and nutrition. And as I pointed out earlier, the challenges we're facing right now are increasing in food security for many, many people. There are about 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to clean and safe drinking water. So there's still much to go in terms of expanding and growing our economies, growing our access to those basic human needs. And at the same time, there's another phenomenon that's happening. And that is that with the growth of our industrial civilization comes the growth of a number of very dramatic pressures on the natural environment, on the natural resources, on the ecosystems that we all depend on in order to survive and thrive. Carbon dioxide concentrations and other greenhouse gases have been going up significantly. And in fact, we've passed the 400 parts per million mark of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Water stress, the number of people under a condition of water shortage and water stress, as those of you living in Sao Paulo have experienced yourselves directly, has been increasing over time, both as population increases and as water availability decreases. The greenhouse gases are increasing the temperature, and with it a host of challenges. And we've seen tremendous loss of biodiversity, loss of those species that took those hundreds of millions of years to accumulate and evolve on this planet. So in addition to that picture, that dashboard of our progress on society and human needs and social progress, we also need to understand this, this kind of overshoot of the planet's ability to support our existence. This is a picture derived from work by Johan Rockström and others at the Stockholm Resilience Center, depicted by Kate Rayworth in her work on planetary boundaries. And the idea here is that there is a certain amount of stress that the Earth can take from us. We can draw down water and rain will fall from the sky and replenish that water. We can put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, CO2, and it will be absorbed by the oceans and the grasses and the forests. But if we go too far, if we push beyond what the Earth can handle, we start to exceed, we start to cross these thresholds that here we call an ecological ceiling, and we cross these boundaries and we start to put ourselves at risk. And in a few of these domains of our environmental impact, we are really dramatically putting ourselves at risk. One of those domains that people talk a lot about in the sustainability field is about climate change. And climate change is an absolutely critical issue for us to be confronting. As I mentioned before, already we've warmed the planet about 1 degree Celsius. So of the average surface temperature of the planet has already increased about 1 degree Celsius above where we were before the Industrial Revolution. And this picture, which comes from the big consensus process of global scientists, identifies what happens if we go from 1 degree Celsius to higher temperatures, 1.5, 2, 3 degrees. And what you see is that we go from no detectable impacts to detectable impacts to significant widespread impacts to very high risks of severe irreversible impacts with limited ability to adapt. This is as close as scientists get to using words like catastrophe. And these are on critical issues like water scarcity, which we depend on for our crops and our built environment, soil erosion, vegetation loss that we need for crops, wildfire damage, which is something we've seen very dramatically in Australia and California, crop yield decline in tropical regions like in Latin America, and food supply instabilities, which can lead to all kinds of conflict. So part of what I think is really important about a sustainability perspective is illustrated by this little cartoon that I found. We're all looking forward to this coronavirus challenge being over, and yet there's this lurking beast behind us in the form of climate change and an increasing frequency of big, challenging disasters and events. On this picture about planetary boundaries, another one that I'll just point out here is about biodiversity loss. Now, when people talk about biodiversity, that means the number of different species of animals and plants and fungi and other organisms on the planet. When we think about the loss of biodiversity, we might be worried about tigers or owls or pangolins or other endangered species, but which may cause some harm, which may cause harm to species other than humans. But the key thing to understand is that we are very dependent on those species. So when we lose biodiversity, for example, if we lose insect populations or bird populations, if you're a farmer, you need those birds and insects to help pollinate your crops and add to your productivity of your farms. So there are ways in which we depend on the natural world. And right now, we're experiencing a very dramatic consequence of that biodiversity loss. And what I mean by that is that our loss of biodiversity, which is driven by our expansion of cities and farms and other human habitation, all of that is putting pressure on wildlife populations. And when that happens, what occurs is that the wildlife population actually shifts. So in Brazil, when you start building human settlements up against the edge of the Amazon rainforest, or in China, where you do that up against the lush river deltas, what happens is that the set of species in the ecosystem shifts from a diverse array of different animals to those that can survive when they live nearby humans. And so what we see is that the amount of species richness, we've lost biodiversity in a whole number of different categories, but the ones that have survived are rats and bats and other rodents and bat populations. And those are animals that have higher frequency of human and animal interaction. And one result of that is what are called zoonotic viruses. Then you take those viruses and you add global connectivity as international tourism increases and dense urban settlement as the world moves from a rural population to an urban population. And you get this recipe for zoonotic diseases, meaning diseases that come from transfer from animals to human populations that can then become global pandemics, like the one we're seeing right now with SARS-CoV-2. And SARS, Ebola, HIV, MERS, E. coli, SARS-CoV-2, all of these viruses have, or bacteria in E. coli's case, have origins in wildlife to human species transfer. The most recent science on SARS-CoV-2 is that it seems to come from a recombination event of virus DNA from a pangolin and from a bat, both of which were in human interaction in China for the reason of all these forces. So what does that mean for us? Is that it means that right now we're all working to create new capabilities, new responses, new ways of operating amid a pandemic. And all of us are looking forward to being over, and we're all hoping this is a once in a lifetime event. And unfortunately, these trends are all going to drive more of this kind of situation. So whatever capabilities you are building right now, whether that's as an individual in your household or in your business or in your supply chain, these are capabilities that you want to have ready at hand on the shelf, because unfortunately, we're going to be seeing more of this. And so the picture, when we put these things together, is this image, which is that we still have a long way to go in meeting some of these basic human needs to continue that incredible progress and success that we've had as a species. And yet somehow, while growing that access, we have to reduce or contain or constrain our impacts on the natural environment to protect and sustain our well-being into the future. And this is our context as business leaders. And it leads to essentially what I've come to understand as a fundamental choice about the world that we are creating right now and the world that we're going to be creating as we navigate through this critical moment. And the question comes down to, are we going to try and just survive this and try to accommodate the changes that are happening, the increased frequency of storms, fires, floods, pollution, pandemics, et cetera, and just learn how to be resilient? That is absolutely necessary because these changes are happening already. But there's also a question about, well, can we do something fundamentally different? Can we use this as a moment of disruption that allows us to invent a new way of operating together, where we can get into what Kate Raworth has depicted as this donut, meaning expand access to the social foundation while containing the ecological ceiling, while containing our environmental impact beneath this ecological ceiling, and get to a safe and just space for humanity. And when things feel so intense and so challenging, it's very hard to have that kind of vision. My colleague Peter Senge at MIT describes it as a kind of creative tension, like you're stretching a rubber band between the current reality that we face and this vision of what might be possible in a new future. And the more we confront the current reality, the tighter that rubber band gets. And the more we try to aspire to a new future, the tighter that rubber band gets. But that is exactly what leadership is being able to hold that tension and allow ourselves to dream and to consider the possibility that we might be able to create a different kind of world. We might be able to create a world with zero waste in energy and materials and water, zero waste in human capabilities in human life. And where our supply chains actually leave the world better than they found them, where the new ideas and innovations that can create a better world get exactly the capital that they need. That's the aspiration, that's the vision of what a sustainable future might look like. And this is a choice that we have right now in this moment of trying to emerge and recreate a world out of the pandemic. And it's a choice that we have that has ripple effects so deep and so wide, it's hard for us even to imagine them. The global scientists and the global planetary historians who have defined all of these different eons, eras, and periods and epochs of history have defined that, in fact, our species grew up in what was called the Holocene epoch. But now we're entering a new epoch, and that epoch is called the Anthropocene. It has the anthropos, the Greek word, the same as the word in the Greek, the origin of the word anthropology, means that we have entered a new era in the history of the planet where the choices that we make as humans define the very landscape, the very climate, the very atmosphere that we are all going to operate in. We all meaning all the species on this earth and the generations that come after us. In this moment, what we're seeing in the COVID-19 pandemic is that these choices are ready at hand. If you look at the recent data about air pollution, for example, there's been significant reductions in PM 2.5, meaning the particle matter that causes the worst respiratory illness. Declines as much as 60% in Delhi. On the right side here, this is a picture on the bottom of, in 2019, the India Gate in Delhi, and then, sorry, 2019, the India Gate in Delhi, this pollution, and then 2020, what it looks like right now. People are seeing, my wife's family is from Calcutta, and people are seeing clear skies for the first time in a decade. On the left here, you see a picture of Mount Kilimanjaro from Nairobi, Kenya, a view that has not been visible. And this is not how we would have wanted to create this cleaning up of the environment. There's tremendous human suffering happening right now. People are dying of COVID-19. Our economies are suffering from the lockdown. This is not how we would have wanted to go about doing it, but it is revealing that it is possible for the earth to begin to heal and to clean up in response to changes in our activity and our behavior. And so what this invites us to do is to think carefully about the world that we're creating. Roberto Rigobon, who did an earlier webinar in this series, he and I have developed this promise framework. And it's a way of thinking about sustainability at multiple levels and multiple dimensions. So that we need to be thinking about sustainability from this environmental perspective of how do we leave intact this incredible wealth of natural resources, including the climate that we've inherited from the past of our planet. But we need to do so in ways that are also compatible with creating sustainable markets and economies, organizations that are able to survive and operate, and our own personal well-being and our own personal health and sustainability. And right now, what's so visible to us is how many conflicts there are between these dimensions, how many trade-offs. Yes, the skies are clearing up. We may be seeing some improvements on the E dimension, but it's some incredible cost on markets and economy and society and personal well-being. But that just invites a question for us, which is that how do we innovate? How do we break some of these trade-offs? How do we relieve some of these tensions by figuring out new ways to operate? If we've learned how to work remotely, can we carry that forward? If we've learned how to reduce our travel, can we carry that forward? If we've learned how to care for one another in our communities and our neighborhoods, can we carry that forward? There are some businesses right now that I think are offering us an example of what it looks like to try to balance among these dimensions and hold these tensions. One example I'll just bring out is the grocery store chain Mercadona, which is based in Spain. And Mercadona, I've been following the news very carefully on this company because it's one that we've taught case studies about at MIT Sloan in the past. And over the last couple of months, I just grabbed a few of the headlines of what the media has been able to cover. Our own colleagues at MIT Sloan, Zainab Tan and Sarah Kalik, have been writing about this. First, their priority was how do they keep their workers safe? And they figured out ways to stay open while keeping their workers safe from transmission of the pandemic. Not only that, but they offered bonuses and increased pay to workers who were having to go and throw themselves in the middle of the risk during the pandemic. And they also figured out a way to change the operations of their stores so as to reduce the number of shoppers and create safe operating environments for retail. They changed their entire work week schedule. So they're going to a 4-day work week for their employees to reduce each individual person's exposure to the virus. And this has been a costly move for them. They've seen their profits drop 95% in March due to this crisis, partly because of this increased payment to their workers, the increased cost of logistics, the personal protective equipment and everything, and the losses. So they're shouldering a burden here, but even amid that moment, the CEO and owner decided to donate his salary and dividends to other organizations that deal with the fallout and the crisis. And the history of Mercadona is that this is exactly the kind of response that they had during the 2009 recession, where they had significant drops in revenue, significant drops in profit, but they still paid their bonuses to their workers and they still managed to operate without layoffs. And at the end of it, they grew much more rapidly after the recession than other chains did, because people understood that they were responsible business owners who had contributed meaningfully during the crisis, and the morale and the culture that they were able to build among their employees was incredibly powerful. So in a sense, Mercadona had found what we sometimes call the business case for sustainability. They found ways to build an upside, a long-term upside for their business out of doing things responsibly in a crisis, building goodwill, reputation, brand value, and mitigating some of the risks that might come from operating in a way that that increases transmission of the pandemic, of the virus, and so on. Part of the way that Mercadona is able to pay its workers more and to survive and thrive is that they are very, very good at taking cost out of every other part of the system other than payroll. And one critical way they do that is by reducing packaging and eliminating plastic packaging, and reducing all those expenditures on physical waste. So they've found ways in a more short-term method to reduce their costs, reduce their waste disposal, their research purchases, by reducing packaging and reducing their environmental footprint at the same time, and then being able to use that extra money to create a really positive work environment. So that's just a quick case to illustrate what we mean by this promise framework. And this is really an invitation, again, in this moment of crisis where our time horizons are so narrow and we're thinking about things on a day-to-day basis, and this is my experience as well, to step back and to take a deep breath and to ask ourselves, in this moment of crisis, and in the subsequent months and quarters and years that follow, what kind of world do we really want to create at every one of these levels? And that's the fundamental question of sustainability. So with that, I'm going to pause here and move over to the Q&A portion of our time together.
Thank you, Jason, for all of your insights. We're definitely living in a time where quick and empathic and inclusive action will most definitely be rewarded for businesses. And if it weren't before, now it is crystal clear that everything in this world is connected, you know, from our personal actions to our business actions, you know, how they're all interwoven and they're pulling different levers along the way and pushing the world forward. So as you said, we have to think, what kind of world do we want to push for?
Yes.
And I think that here it is where the key is to build back better, you know, to build more sustainable, to build more circular futures. And some people in the questions were asking is like, well, what about now with COVID? You know, is sustainability going to take a step backwards?
Yes.
And I think that this is a great time to talk about trade-offs.
Yes.
So what do you think when people say, you know, how do I weigh the economic versus the cultural consequences when I'm implementing a project? Or what are we going to do now? What is better for society? Can we have your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, look, one of the things that is really clear about the pandemic is how unequal it is in its impacts. And that inequality goes to vulnerable communities being hit harder. We see that very acutely, both within my home state of Massachusetts and globally. But also it hits different industries and different business subsectors incredibly unequally. The restaurant sector has been devastated by this. in a way that other sectors, outdoor construction activities, seem to be operating at normal pace in many locations. And so everyone's going to be in a very different spot. And so I think it's hard to come up with some universal prescriptions about what kind of sustainability efforts you can do right now. I think one thing to say is that if we come back to some of these business value drivers for sustainability, when we think, like, there's some categories of sustainability work where we're creating or innovating to develop new products. So you think about the Tesla car, that is a very fast, powerful, high acceleration electric vehicle that has very low emissions per mile or per kilometer for its vehicle class. Investing in building a new business line like that right now to drive new revenues and new business development, depending on your cash position, may be incredibly challenging right now. And the reality may be that some of those projects are going to have to wait. They're going to have to go on hold. And instead, things that are focused on cost reduction, where everybody's trying to slice their budgets and try to squeeze out, margin given reduced revenues and reduced economic activity, that may be where people focus their attention right now, looking on ways to reduce energy use, reduce materials use, reduce waste, maybe move toward more circular economy solutions. And so that might be one way to go about this. But there are clearly trade-offs, and there are definitely ways in which certain sustainability efforts are going to take a step back. It's unavoidable. I mean, for example, just one simple example is in reuse. Like you mentioned circular economy, the idea that we're going to reuse our materials as much as possible to eliminate waste. That's a phenomenal strategy. And you see things like Rent the Runway, like these startups which are trying to provide, clothing rentals and so on. But this is a moment where people are going to be much more hesitant to want to wear the shirt off of someone's back that they've just worn the day before, because they might be concerned about infection risk, validly or not. And so there are, just like every sector of our economy, things are going to be hit a bit by this pandemic.
Yeah, just some of the questions we're starting with, well, how much is this all going to cost us?
Yes.
And I think what you just said is key. Some of this are not necessarily costs. They can actually be cost cutting, because it's all about efficiencies and it's all about how to make our business more resilient. And the funny thing about this whole COVID scenario is that it's actually pushing forward things that were already pushing us. So it's pushing forward us thinking about sustainability in many other aspects, not only sustainability areas and sustainability people. We're already talking to sustainability with the executive committees. And what we're seeing here is that this where to play scenario that is usually used to build strategies is being shattered with this new normal. So how do you suggest executive committees incorporate and start thinking about sustainability?
So I think the picture I've got here is a pretty good one, in the sense, a pretty good starting point for that question, in a sense of trying to step back, especially, and to think about risks. I mean, there's a whole suite of risks that people were largely not anticipating that we're all now having to confront, about a pandemic, the direct effects of the virus, as well as the subsequent economic effects of the lockdowns and social distancing efforts. Was that predictable? I mean, there's a phenomenal video clip of Barack Obama from 2013 talking about the risk of global pandemics and the need to have a coordinated national response. The paper, the research I described earlier about how wildlife-human interactions are going to increase the risk of zoonotic diseases and viruses, those papers were all published in the 2006 to 2013 timeframe. So the knowledge has been out there, the science has been out there. And I think the first thing is to be able to kind of do a scan and really understand, wait, what are these big megatrends like the ones I've described on this call? And how could these potentially bear on our business? And what are the scenarios that we haven't even considered but that we need our strategy to be robust to. So I think scenario analysis is a really critical piece of that puzzle to really understand these risks. And then this operational analysis to say, what can we do to reduce costs in any way that we haven't thought about, and which may have some possibility of reducing our environmental footprint. Walmart is a phenomenal example on this score, to use another retail example. I mean, they've found literally billions of dollars of savings straight to the bottom line from reducing transportation, reducing packaging, reducing energy use in stores, moving towards renewable energy, a whole variety of different programming that has enabled them to drop money to the bottom line. So I think really looking for, I think what goes behind that question that someone posed about, how much is this all going to cost? What that reflects is this very common mental model or perspective, that what I call the background conversation of sustainability. It's the thing that people are often thinking and feeling but not saying out loud, which is that there must be this trade-off. There must be this tension between trying to create companies and portfolios and societies that are sustainable, healthy, biodegradable, renewable, responsible, et cetera. There must be a trade-off between that and doing good business, making good money, keeping things low cost. And the reality is that, yes, sometimes those trade-offs exist, but what our role is as business leaders is not to get stuck in this mentality, because the only place that this leads is to this kind of fractious, polarized view of sustainability. These are some cartoons that we had done for our Breaking Through Gridlock book. And it's like, on the one hand, if this is the view of the world, then these are the only kind of positions to take. Save the planet, kill yourself. Look, the skies are clean, everything's better. It's like, well, yeah, but you're not paying attention to the fact that millions of people are dying of a new virus. On the other hand, completely ignoring all of it and saying, we're just going to charge forward and open the economy and burn all the fossil fuels, and the climate, we'll mine the other planets later. That's also a totally stuck view. And what we need to do fundamentally is to change that conversation and go from a one-dimensional view of the world to at least a two-dimensional view, and say, yes, there might be this trade-off between our performance and our sort of positive social impact, but we can break that trade-off. We can, oftentimes companies will start by just making that trade-off in a different way. So Nike, when they started trying to reduce waste, they made a new shoe called the Trash Talk by sewing together waste from old shoes, and it didn't work. Nobody bought it because it didn't add any value to the customer. But then the next step of their journey was to push the envelope and say, no, we want to have something that is both high performance and has a positive impact. And they invented Nike Flyknit, which is a technology for weaving the entire shoe from a single thread and having no waste on the factory floor, which is a reduction in cost and a reduction in environmental footprint. It's leather and nylon you didn't have to manufacture. And this is a shoe, these shoes are lighter weight, more breathable. They provide more performance for the athletes, in the same way that a Tesla is both a fast car that also reduces the environmental footprint. And that's the kind of thinking that we have to do right now, is not just get stuck in this sort of tired debate of, oh, it's going to cost us too much, and so therefore we can't do anything. We have to get creative, and we have to look at ways where we can break those trade-offs. And that's the fundamental kind of point of view behind this promise perspective, is to say, wow, if I want to do all of this at the same time, I have to look for ways that I assume that there are trade-offs, and I have to look for new ways of doing things.
So we're getting lots of questions, and don't worry if we don't address them now. There's a lot of other ways that we can engage, and we will definitely keep this conversation moving forward. But now that you've just talked, Jason, about polarizing different points of views when we have these conversations, coming from Latin America, I feel that we definitely have that here a lot. When you go in and start talking about sustainability, you either have this point of view or this point of view, and they seem to clash. For everyone that hasn't read Jason's book, Breaking Through the Gridlock, I highly encourage it. It's a really good book about conversations. So if you could tell us, Jason, 2 top tips about having these difficult conversations, whether they be at home or in businesses. Go ahead. You're on mute, Jason.
Thanks. I was just eliminating some background noise here. So a couple of tips, and there's a TEDx talk that elaborates on some of this, but the book is basically a cautionary note for advocates of sustainability that we don't end up looking too much like this guy who's sort of preaching and telling everybody what to do and being kind of self-righteous and aggressive in our approach. The key is to really take a step back and if we're trying to advocate for sustainability and we're finding ourselves getting some resistance or this kind of polarization, to really ask ourselves, okay, what is it that the other person values? And can I step back from my own point of view and my own feeling of self-righteousness to say, okay, what is the concern that this person has? They're worried about losing revenue. They're worried about losing business. They're worried about losing their freedom or autonomy if we have stronger environmental regulations. Really getting present to and understanding what is the other person value and what are they afraid to lose if we were to make some kind of a change. And being compassionate with that and understanding that, in fact, in this picture, all of us want all of these things. Like I would love to have a cleaning product that both works in my bathroom and doesn't pollute the environment. I want a car that's fun to drive and has a low footprint. I want a way of working where I have freedom and flexibility and connection with my colleagues and doesn't leave me on traffic and emitting pollution out of my car for 3 hours a day. And that it's when we really empathize with somebody else's values and we hold the tension between those values and say, you know what, like Nike, I'm not going to give up on performance and I'm not going to give up on impact. We together have to explore what are the new options we can try, what are the innovations we can try that will break those trade-offs together in ways that neither of us could do alone. But it takes a moment of taking a deep breath and letting go for a moment of being right and righteous, and inquiring into what's really important to both parties and what can we do together to innovate.
We are getting a lot of questions, and thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. No, keep them coming.
We're actually getting a copy of all of your questions, so we will be able to talk about them. Please feel free to further engage with us. I set up the BRECA LinkedIn and the sustainability email that we have, and Jason has this slide, if you could put it, Jason, about how further to engage with MIT Sustainability Initiative, the MIT Own Sustainability Initiative. So for the last question, because I think we are about to run out of time, Jason, what are your top 3 tips for anyone that's looking to integrate sustainability in their business today?
Okay. So the first tip is to build a cross-functional conversation. One of the things that we've seen about sustainability is that it does not respect any organizational silos. If you want to improve packaging or transportation or your work practices, moving toward more virtual work or whatever, it's going to require operations and sales and human resources and logistics and so many different parts of the business. So one of the first things is to be able to have a cross-functional conversation and just get those people in the room together and create a framework for them to work together. And leaders of organizations are critical in being able to do that convening. The second thing is, as I mentioned, to look at the business sort of the drivers of the business. Where is there some intersection between risks that we face as a business, costs that we face as a business, and sustainability, so that if we were to improve the way we work with people, improve the way we work with natural resources, we might be able to reduce some of those risks, reduce some of those costs. And that's often an operational question, a supply chain question. And then with a slightly different audience, to look at this upside question of, are there new business opportunities that we could be reaching into? Are there customer segments we could be reaching? Are there new technologies we could be using that might actually allow us to create new lines of business, new ways of doing things that are aligned with sustainability?
And
so that's
for
the process.
all of those businesses, Jason, all of those businesses that are in Latin America and in Africa and certain other parts of the world where informality is such a big chunk of the economy, is there an extra tip that you might be willing to give us?
It's a fantastic question. In fact, informality lies at the crux of so many of these sustainability issues, right? So if I think about this picture about the donut and what it means to create a world that is more sustainable, and to think about managing these risks, it's exactly in our supply chain for palm oil in Indonesia, where you have informal smallholder farmers, that we see some of the biggest pressure on land conversion from rainforests and biodiversity loss. It's exactly where we have informality in our workplaces, subcontracting out janitorial services and everything, that we see our own employees or employees of our contractors facing some of these gaps in terms of meeting their basic needs, in terms of having a voice, in terms of social equity. And so, I completely agree that is a central question in this topic of sustainability. I think the answer there is very context dependent, but the key is to create some kind of voice. I mean, the broader view here of a promise-based capitalism, or a promise-based form of management, is a shift from a shareholder view of the firm, meaning the purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholder returns, to a stakeholder-based view of the firm, where the purpose of the firm is to create value for all of its stakeholders. And like a company like Mercadona, that's the underlying principle of how they operate, is that they are a stakeholder-driven firm. And part of the way that you do that is you have to give those stakeholders a voice. So even if there is informality, creating some mechanism for those informal workers to weigh in on company practices. You see some of these interesting technology startups which are giving mobile apps, SMS-based mobile apps, to workers in factories in China, so that a brand like Nike can actually get some view from them, and even from informal subcontractors, about the quality of their labor conditions, or what's happening on farms, or what's happening on the edge of vulnerable ecosystems and forests. Getting some channel of communication, so that when you are going to try to assess those risks to your business and the sources of cost, you have a wider view and a wider set of voices than the usual C-suite crowd. Just as we're coming to the close of our time here, I just want to say a couple of words about how you can engage further on these topics with MIT. When Lee introduced me, he said I was the director of the Sustainability Initiative at MIT. We have a website that describes some of our efforts. We have executive education programs that are 3 to 5 days long throughout the year. 2 that I'm very closely involved in. One is called Strategies for Sustainable Business. It's a 3-day overview of how to translate these big picture views into concrete business strategies. Family enterprise is a really critical topic in this whole space. Mercadona is itself a family-owned enterprise. and many of you in Latin America are involved in family-owned enterprises, the mentality of an owner, a multi-generational owner, is essential in being able to have that long-time horizon of sustainability. And so I work together with John Davis, who's one of the leading family business scholars, to do programming on future family enterprises, and a new program we're developing called Owning Impact, which is about how families, business families can drive positive impact through business operations, philanthropy, and impact investing. And then we're active on social media, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, where you can get a feed of the latest research and the latest innovation that's happening out of our sustainability community.
So just before we end, and we're trying to be as punctual as possible. I know Jason in the States and Jacqueline, 6 p.m. is dinner time. In Latin America, people will eat much later, but we don't want them to be late for dinner. We would very much like to thank Adriana and Breca for moderating and taking part in this. We're also very thankful for them for all they're doing on sustainability. It's really something to be admired. That being said, I very much thank Jason and the Sustainability Initiative for taking the time today. It is the end of the semester at MIT, so a little bit difficult to get people's time, but we very much appreciate it. And also another way, please don't hesitate to email me or the Latin America office. We'd love to have more of Jason and the initiative in Latin America, helping us and helping the different companies get to a point where we can have capitalism, but sustainability at the same time. So thank you all. Please stay safe, please stay healthy, and please don't forget to stay in touch with us. Thank you all, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Lee, for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana, for the great conversation and for the work that you're doing at Breca. And to all of the participants who joined, really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you all. You have a great evening.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao.